400 years of colonization and a quarter-century of conflict. Starting in late 1999, the IMF has provided a significant amount of technical assistance as part of international efforts to reconstruct Timor-Leste's economy. Since it began exploiting its vast reserves of oil and gas in the Timor Sea just a few years ago, Timor-Leste has seen its revenue grow steadily, yet it remains the poorest country in Asia. In 2004, Timor-Leste started receiving a windfall revenue gain when oil production began in earnest. The newly independent country, deeply impoverished, suddenly began to receive enormous amounts of money. The country needed to find a way to quickly put in place a system for managing its petroleum revenue. With technical assistance from the IMF, it set up a sovereign wealth fund so that over time, ordinary people in Timor-Leste could reap the benefits.
It's petroleum revenues that's actually driving the development activities in the country. But the laws in the country also provide for the petroleum revenues to be saved for future generations. And the country has done extremely well in this regard.
An IMF resident advisor, supported by Japanese financing, helped draft the Petroleum Fund Act, which ensures that petroleum revenues are managed in a sustainable way. This law places restrictions on how much, and for what reason, money can be withdrawn from the fund.
Well, the IMF was instrumental, I think, in the process in 2004, 2005 of setting up the petroleum fund. I mean, they weren't the only people, right? Norway was involved, the World Bank was involved, and of course Timor-Leste's government was the principal institution responsible for that. And I think the country is very fortunate to have a petroleum fund.
But establishing the petroleum fund alone was not enough. The Timorese people wanted to make sure the funds were managed with a high degree of transparency and accountability. So the government worked with an IMF technical assistance expert to put in place the Transparency Portal, an information technology system for publishing quarterly reports on the internet. The IMF helped lay the groundwork for this portal by improving fund management and fiscal reporting.
The government basically provides regular updates on public spending across the country. They've started to put some information in relation to procurements, so upcoming contract awards and contract tenders are posted there. I mean, I think that it's potentially a very useful resource for Parliament and for the Timorese public to actually track what's happening with government expenditure.
We thought, well, if we are as transparent as possible, then everybody will know where the money is going, who is actually getting that money, and is he or she doing what she is supposed to do with that money.
One can either approach corruption reduction from an investigatory and a punitive angle, or one can actually tackle the issue up front and put in place the foundations to actually strengthen financial management systems and reduce the scope for corruption. And I think that a lot of the work that the IMF in the Treasury, in the Ministry of Finance has been doing has actually been contributing to strengthening financial management systems, both in the Ministry of Finance and across government.
But while nearly everyone in this fledgling democracy can agree that transparency in public spending is a good thing, there's much debate on just how the country's nest egg should be spent.
There was a school of thought that you should put more emphasis on the savings for the future. But there was another school of thought that said, wait, there is no future if you don't invest now. And the current government believed strongly that you needed to invest now in some very basic things like infrastructure and human resources to enable us to actually have a future.
The development challenges in Timor really are enormous. There's a season which they call the hungry season. For 2 or 3 months of every year, a lot of people across the country in the rural areas go without food.
The country's budget has increased from $400 million 4 years ago to about $1.6 billion, allowing the government to spend on priority areas like healthcare, education and infrastructure.
The savings in the petroleum fund have gone up considerably. It's reached $10 billion now. This has been done through very prudent investments that the government has been doing over the past few years. This is important, keeping in mind that the oil revenues of Timor-Leste are finite.
This is a make or break moment for Timor-Leste. The country cannot afford to squander its newfound wealth. The stakes are too high. But if Timor-Leste chooses wisely, the future could yet be bright.
Peace has been the biggest dividend that they have been able to build upon. And I think if peace is sustained, Timor-Leste will definitely go places.
When I look around, I see all the ingredients for a miracle in the 21st century, for the nation to be the next miracle. Timor-Leste has all the ingredients if it is well managed. And so far, so good. So far, so good.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us at this event this afternoon, where we're very pleased to be able to get together to talk about issues concerning how fragile states work on fiscal reforms and the support they need and the issues that arise from the particular circumstances they face. I think the Timor-Leste video is a good backdrop to the discussion we'll have. Of course, a small, fragile state grappling suddenly with managing natural resource wealth and using IMF technical assistance well in trying to meet that challenge. Good to see the interest in this event. It's not often that fragile states get as much attention as they deserve. That attention is too sparse sometimes and too intermittent, I think. So it's really good to see all of you here. I think the first question that often arises, of course, is definitions and what we mean by fragile states. And Sanjeev and Catherine, of course, will speak to that right off the top of their presentation. But I think specifics of the definition aside, we all would agree that institution building is really the most difficult, among the most difficult challenges in fragile states, and the most critical one in many ways. And of course, central to that state building as well is the building of fiscal capacity, given the importance of the fiscal side in the economy, and building fiscal capacity in institutions. And that's been a significant focus of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department work for many years, not just in the technical assistance they provide, but also in their contribution to IMF-supported programs that in fragile states often have a very heavy fiscal focus. I myself was a significant beneficiary of that type of work when I was in Liberia, of course, but also during my time at the African Department at the IMF. So very pleased to have two senior FAD, Fiscal Affairs Department, excuse me, this is fun acronym land, but senior officials, Sanjeev Gupta and Catherine Bayer, who are here to make their presentation on building fiscal capacity in fragile states. And that's based on a recent policy paper, IMF policy paper. Also thrilled to have Sarah Cliff and Steve Radlett join us, two well-seasoned fragile states experts, academics on the one hand, but policy advice based on considerable experience, both of them. And they'll join us in the panel after the presentation. Without going on much longer, let me quickly introduce Sanjeev and Catherine. Sanjeev is Deputy Director of FAD, and previously was in the African and European departments as well, and before joining the fund with the Kiel Institute of World Economics in Germany, with the Administrative Staff College of India, and Secretary of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Sanjeev has authored all kinds of papers, and so many of them, and so many co-authored or co-edited 12 books, the most recent of them being Fiscal Policy and Inequality in 2015, and just this year, Fiscal Politics. So that's Catherine. And then Catherine, of course, is Chief of the Revenue Administration Division 2 in FAD, And that division provides technical assistance in customs and tax to more than 80 IMF member countries, both in the Western Hemisphere and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And her division also oversees work out of 7 technical assistance centers, 5 of which are in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And during her career, she's also helped design and implement reforms, tax and customs reforms in Asia and in Europe, and the former Soviet Union, including in crisis countries there. So prior to joining the fund, Catherine was with the Treasury, U.S. Treasury, as a financial economist working on budget issues as well, and head of research in Mexican tax administration. Let's ask you to come and make your presentation. I think Sanjeev will come up first. Thank you.
I think the PowerPoint. Yeah. Thank you, Antoinette, for a very generous introduction. We will take no more than 20 minutes, so I'm going to put a stopwatch so that I spend no more than 10 minutes. Now, this is the second paper that we are doing at the fund on this topic. The first one we did was in 2004. And in those days, the fund did not have a definition of fragile states. So we used to call them post-conflict countries. So that paper was titled Post-Conflict Countries. But essentially, they covered countries in the same group. And so for this particular paper, we we have a definition which is based on the World Bank's CPIA, 3-year average of 3.2. Any country that falls below that is deemed to be fragile, and along with the fact that it should have had a conflict in the past 3 years. This definition slightly differs from the World Bank, which bases things more on the conflict or the CPI in that particular year rather than the average of 3 years. So there is that difference. So using this definition, when we wrote this paper, we had 39 countries. But since then, that is about 3 weeks ago, we revised the number to 43. But what is interesting is that in the course of time, that is over the period that we covered in the paper, about 53 countries have passed through this category, which basically means about 30% of the fund membership was at some point or the other deemed as fragile. So it's not an insignificant constituency in the fund's membership. So that's, I think, what looking at. The second point is that half of them are in Africa. So that's the other notable point we should take on board. So, and during this period that we have studied, 19 have remained fragile on a continuous basis, whereas 18 went out of it. And so which shows that there is some churning in the categories. Now, we also went and met with the Fragility Commission headed by David Cameron in July. And so there were 4 of us making presentation. One person was talking about Pakistan, and the other person was talking about Nigeria, but none of the countries are in this list. So the point I wanted to make here is that the definition is not very clear. Some people see some countries in this category, others don't see them in the category. So there is a whole lot of discussion on what really is a fragile state. We have agreed on 3.2 CPI, but when I was making a presentation to the Commission, the experiences they were referring to from Pakistan and Nigeria, they were not in my sample size. So that tells you. So what do we see here in terms of general characteristics about the fragile states? Perhaps one is that they rely heavily on grants, about roughly 5% of GDP. But when you look at the grants, their grants have fallen since 2006 to 2007. They used to get twice as much on average. So the grants are less. And then, of course, their per capita GDP is much lower. Their growth is lower, and they have a lot more macro imbalances if you look at different types of indicators. And if you look at the geographical distribution, it only tells you again that Africa is afflicted more by fragility. And of course, then you have many small island countries as well included in this, so which have very special kind of problems in development. And they are affected, the small countries, by climate change a lot more than the other countries. So, so what do we draw from looking at these broad indicators? That first, that the fragile states have, frequent external or internal wars. They are, as I said earlier, given that there is a lot of small states, they are vulnerable to natural disasters. And then we do find, looking at different indices, again, perception-based indices, they are also seem to be ranking high on corruption, which is a reflection of weakness in institutions. And then also we find that many of them, and this was a point that was made by Antoinette, that they seem to have high incidence of fund-supported programs. So what are the other characteristics of these countries? On the left side of the slide, you see the difference between the revenue ratios of the fragile states vis-a-vis non-fragile states. Of course, over time, the revenue ratios have risen by about 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP on average between 2004 and 2014. But they still remain substantially lower than other countries, which tells you that a lot more needs to be done, especially in the context of the Addis agenda, to strengthen their capacity to mobilize more revenues, which means having to develop their institutions. Looking at the composition of revenues, we find surprisingly that they don't rely much on indirect taxes, which is they seem to rely more on customs duties, and so that tells you they don't have much corporate taxes and so on and so forth. So there is a structure of taxation which one could look at in terms of going forward. On the expenditure side, they spend a hell of a lot more on wages as a share of total spending. And it could also reflect that they are trying to absorb some of the combatants into the civil service or into the army. I mean, we still see that as an issue in a number of other countries in Africa, where you do have conflict, and suddenly the wages for the army and others are increased. They spend very little on social spending. There is much less, but they spend a lot more on capital. And this could be a reflection of the fact that the donors are giving assistance to rebuild the country, and that basically is the case here. So I think I will stop here, and I have taken 9 minutes, so I think Catherine will talk about the...
Thank you. You gave me an extra minute. That's very, very generous of you. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is, against the background that Sanjeev has just sort of set, how do we and the teams of the Fiscal Affairs Department design fiscal strategies to reflect the varying degrees of fragility in IMF member countries? And what this schema, or what this framework tries to do, is just to explain in simple terms the different approaches based on the degree of fragility that a country may find itself in. And it's a sort of a kind of sort of the broad approach that will then, of course, be country specific. And I think one of the points I'd like to make is that in every case, of course, IMF missions very much are tailor-making or tailor-designing their revenue and expenditure strengthening approaches, or approaches to what's happening in the country, to a specific situation of the country. And the second point in looking at this diagram that kind of provides a schematic schematic presentation on how we design the strategies is that this is not necessarily a linear reform or a linear approach, that countries may be in conflict or disaster, then go to the immediate post-conflict stage, which is sort of the peach color, and then instead of sort of going forward to less fragile and still vulnerable but less fragile stage, they may fall back into conflict or disaster. So this is not to mean that that countries progress in a linear way through these stages, but it's just a way of trying to convey some of the policies that are recommended. Of course, in the conflict disaster stages, it's a kind of a wait and see what's going to happen, but engage with the country and to see how the Fiscal Affairs Department and how technical teams can provide advice to strengthen revenue and expenditure systems and deal even in the midst of conflict and disaster. And Liberia is a good example of that, of providing TA in the midst of the Ebola crisis. And the next stage is an approach of focusing on getting revenue up and running, focusing on targeted revenue collection by looking at customs duties at the border on imports, by focusing on large sectors of the economy using excise and targeted taxes. That's one example. On the expenditure side, in the post-conflict period, their focus would be on preparing annual budgets, basic payment systems. And then, of course, in the yellow, we're moving into more medium-term design strategies that involve establishing more medium-term strategies on the revenue side, thinking about segmenting the taxpayer population, strengthening the major taxes, or maybe even introducing a value-added tax. On the expenditure side, establishing medium-term public financial management capacity, developing more medium-term budgeting frameworks, and focusing on IT systems. So they're just examples of some of the approaches that are used at different levels of fragility, if you will, and also very much tailored to what's happening in the country, to country-specific circumstances. Then another point that's important is, well, what basis are we using, are IMF technical teams using, and the authorities to assess where the countries are? Tools such as the Public Expenditure Framework Assessment and the Tax Administration Diagnostic Assessment tools can help identify some of the common TA needs, and also have a common understanding with the authorities and donor agencies or TA providing agencies, where are the major weaknesses. And these spider graphs just provide a little bit of a view of where the criteria that are used to assess public expenditure frameworks on the left-hand side, and the criteria that are used to assess tax administration systems, and then where the fragile states fare. As you can see on the public expenditure framework, they of course are the weakest compared to in their public expenditure frameworks compared to low-income countries and emerging market economies. But they're you know, and in the areas that are weakest are the budget preparation, cash and debt management, and those areas that are, you know, important to have budget institutions working smoothly. On the tax side, weaknesses are all around. I mean, the spider graphs look much less smooth because there have been much fewer assessments done. It's a more recently developed tool. But there, you know, pretty much in all of the core tax administration areas, you can see that the fragile states, the fragile countries are doing pretty poorly on, you know, on core issues such as timely filing and payment of taxes, accurate reporting in tax returns, et cetera. So, in other words, this is just by way of telling you that there are tools that are being applied that are standardized tools on the expenditure and revenue sides for the fragile states as part of our technical assistance, and that these also help inform the type of advice that's going to be given in any particular country. An important, I think, point to make for those of you who are looking at, well, how does the FID provide TA to the fragile states and what are the tendencies? And these graphs show that basically the Fiscal Affairs Department TA to these 39 countries in this case has increased significantly in the past decade. On the left-hand side, we see that the share of fiscal TA to fragile states has increased. It's the blue line, very much following the tendency for the low-income countries. That's without the fragile states. So the tendency is increasing. And this increase has in part been supported by this available sources of funding for externally financed funding that's available through some of the trust funds that have been established, multi-donor trust funds, to support revenue mobilization, to support the management of natural resource wealth in the fragile states. So increase in FADTA to the fragile states and low-income countries, and in part facilitated or supported by the availability of external funding. There's a mix in terms of how, what type of technical assistance is delivered to the fragile states, and these pie charts just show the breakdown between the missions on the expenditure and revenue sides over the decade of 2006 to 2016. The mix of headquarters missions, short-term expert missions, and these are the 2-week missions, and then what we call long-term expert missions, which are normally the resident advisors that spend a year or more in the country. And here, one of the differences one sees is that there's been more long-term advisors focusing on the public financial management side, that's on the budget side. In part, this has to do with a requirement by donors that long-term advisors be in the field when they're providing resources to the country. So it's, in a way, it's sort of having quality control, not only institutional capacity building, but quality control on the funds that are being provided externally to the countries. The green on the revenue side is lower and is probably increasing, will be increasing in this year and next. Just taking very quickly a look at some of the results of the capacity building on the revenue side. I mean, measuring the impact of technical assistance interventions is pretty difficult. But having said that, we have tried in the paper to look at some of the trends in the countries that have received technical assistance that have been the biggest recipients. On the revenue side, we found that 11 out of the 19 countries that have been 11 out of the 19 countries received 70% of the technical assistance over the decade of 2004 to 2014. Those countries did better in terms of increasing their tax to GDP ratios. So the red dots above the line are the increased tax to GDP ratios and more intensive recipients of technical assistance. So one has to take into account, though, that that's not the only thing going on, as both Antoinette and Sanjeev mentioned. There, in many of these countries, overall macroeconomic adjustment and strengthening programs that also help explain why revenues could have increased. On the public financial management side, on the expenditure management side, we also looked at the scores of these standardized assessment that I mentioned earlier, the PIFA scores in some core areas. In the case study countries, we looked at eight case studies, And this presents some scores on the PIFA for 6 of them. And what's interesting is that we can also see, in general, there's been some improvement with the green being the increased scores in some core PIFA indicators like budget credibility, cash management, accounts and reporting, and transparency in several of the countries that are the fragile states that are receiving PFM, technical assistance. So that's a positive trend that we see. So just to wrap up, because I don't want to take up any more of my 10 minutes, if we were to describe FAD's responses to some of the challenges presented in the fragile states on improving revenue and expenditure institutions, so those fiscal institutions, we have a couple of general observations that we drew as a result of the paper. One is the importance of targeting fiscal technical assistance to achieve fiscal stability, financial control, and for the country to secure its own revenues, so targeting the TA specifically to those objectives. Also, the importance of setting priorities in designing reforms and implementing them and paying attention to the sequencing of reforms. Often this is one of the things that the TA missions are focusing on the most, what is possible and within which time frame. It's very important to promote effective donor coordination. In many of the fragile states, there are lots of donors active on the ground and behind the scenes, and having a mechanism to promote effective donor coordination is really key to enabling the country to move forward. We also found that despite the fact that many fragile states may be volatile and there might be instability in the government, there's value to having medium-term reform focus, so that once the country's out of sort of immediate fragility state, then the institutional reforms can begin to be looked at and built over the medium term, 3 to 5 years. So there's value in having an idea of where what the outcome should be 3 or 5 years from now. We found that on the revenue side, it's important not to estimate customs and the role of customs in generating revenue. Often countries will focus on the tax side, the domestic tax institutions, but customs is usually a very important revenue raiser, often half or even more of total revenue. In the fragile states, it's important to consider more extensive TA presence and more flexible TA delivery modes. Just before coming on stage, we were talking about technology and the advantages that technology affords us, and certainly having remote communications and remote training, this type of activity, and also off-site meetings and off-site technical assistance provision is a possibility, especially for countries where security is an issue. So flexible TA delivery and more TA presence. And finally, but certainly not least, is ensuring that the IMF's technical assistance is well integrated into the IMF's lending and surveillance operations, because the fiscal TA aspect of our work is only part of the overall government institutional framework, and certainly a macroeconomic scenario. So ensuring that TA is integrated into how we're looking at the overall economy is key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev and Catherine, for that presentation. We're organizing ourselves up here, but thank you for keeping to the time, and thank you for being very succinct and clear in presenting your work and your lessons that you've drawn from working with fragile states. Let me quickly introduce Sarah and Steve and invite them also to join the stage. Sarah is currently director of New York University's Center on International Cooperation. And before that, of course, she was a special representative for the bank's development report on conflict, security, and development, and also special advisor and Assistant Secretary General of Civilian Capacities at the United Nations. Sarah has worked for 20 plus years in numerous African and Asian countries emerging from conflict and political transition. Her work at the bank covered post-conflict reconstruction, community-driven development, civil service reform. And she's also led the bank's Fragile and Conflict-Affected Countries Group and was also Director of Operations in the East Asia region. And Steve Radlett is no stranger to CGD, of course. He was a senior fellow at CGD before and now holds the Donald F. McHenry Chair in Global Human Development and is also a distinguished professor of the practice of development and director of the Global Human Development Program at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And prior to joining the School of Foreign Service, he served as chief economist for USAID and as senior advisor for development for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Steve has served since 2005 as economic advisor to President Sirleaf, my former boss, and so Steve and I work together in that regard. And he's acted in similar capacities to President Joyce Banda of Malawi and the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia and the Ministry of Finance and Trade in the Gambia. So let me stop there and ask them to give us their perspective on the presentation that was just given, and we'll start with Sarah.
Great. Shall I just speak from
Yes,
here?
yes,
Can everyone
that's fine.
hear me fine? So thank you very much to Sanjeev and to Catherine for the presentation. I thought that the paper has in it some very good, sensible points, which really make sure that there's a nuance in how the fund approaches fragile states. Those include the first stage reform recommendations, which I thought were particularly good on the revenue side. The sense of long time frames involved in building up capacity in fragile states, which is still a repeated mistake that we make in these situations. We expect progress to be made in 1 to 3 years. We know that it takes, in fact, 20 years to build from a Haiti level to a Ghana level of development. And I liked particularly the points that were made in cautioning against bringing in big model laws from outside, focusing too much on bringing entire organizational models from outside, and rather looking at what can be adapted from what already exists inside the country. I think these are all very good points and very consistent with what we know in the literature and the policy practice elsewhere. It's very good to see them being taken up. Areas where I would have liked to see perhaps an opportunity for the fund to help move the debate forward, and these are then questions that I would put to you, relate to the objective of our assistance, and particularly the relationship between macro policy and peace and justice in these countries. Secondly, innovations in technical assistance. What do we know about newer ways of delivering technical assistance? And third, the political economy of reform. So on the relationship of macro policy to peace, I think the paper has a description, of course, of how conflict affects these countries. I thought that this was, if anything, slightly underplayed, because even those countries that are not currently in conflict are almost always either still recovering from conflict or at some risk of conflict occurring because of their institutional weaknesses. There are two elements there that I would like to ask you what came out of your cases. One is whether for countries in conflict, you are increasingly finding that there's a useful role for the fund in trying to preserve institutional capacity that would otherwise collapse. And I ask this question actually because of following to some extent discussions in Yemen and in Libya, where those issues are very live issues right now. There are institutions that the fund would normally engage with that are at risk of collapsing, and a difficult question about how might you try to prevent that collapse without serving the interests of one particular faction in the conflict. Then a second question on the objectives would be what you feel the cases have told you about fiscal position when you are looking at preventing conflict from occurring. either from recurring in a post-conflict country or from occurring for the first time in a country that is fragile and has some conflict risk. And I'm thinking of this in the context of the forthcoming report that the UN and the World Bank are authoring on conflict prevention, which looks at the cost effectiveness of investing in prevention. And it raises a question, does it in fact make sense for countries in some circumstances on some certain type of investments? Examples might be security sector reform or decreasing inequality between ethnic and sectarian groups. Does it make sense for countries to spend more money on those investments from a perspective of avoiding conflict than it might otherwise make sense from a macro perspective? The second question on innovation is really what do you feel that you have learned from some of the thinking on focusing technical assistance on practical problems? So I'm thinking here of work that Lant Pritchett and others at Harvard have done on looking at capacity building as being problem-driven and being a very iterative process that should not rely just on short-term, long-term experts and seminars, but at working with counterparts on practical problems that they're facing in a Ministry of Finance or a revenue authority, for instance, and working with them to solve those problems. And the last question or set of questions were on the political economy. So I thought there were some incredibly intriguing hints in the paper on this. So there are times at which you say that political economy constraints were an issue in Haiti, in Afghanistan, in Kosovo. But in fact, what we can learn from the fund's experience on the political economy, I think should perhaps be a more major part of the debate. So understanding a bit more, what did you find to be those constraints? Was it the relationship to leaders' personal fortunes, to their constituency, to the way that reforms affected power relations, to the way that they affected international relations potentially for the country? And what might that tell us for sequencing reforms in future? And also for how the fund itself might engage in looking at political economy analysis, and also how it might partner with others who bring that to the field.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Sarah. So let's turn immediately to Steve and come back to Sanjeev and Catherine later with some responses.
Good. Thanks, and thanks everybody for being here and for inviting me to participate. It's great to be back to my old haunts, although actually when I was at CGD we weren't actually here, so anyway, but it's great to be back at CGD and to be part of this panel and to see old friends and to push me to think more about these issues. First thing I want to point out is something that was not in the presentation, which was the actual amounts of money at stake here in terms of revenue capacity within developing countries. And Sanjeev can correct me because he knows these numbers better than I do. But for low and middle income countries around the world, I believe that total tax revenues today are on the order of about $2.5 trillion, more than $2 trillion, I think. Is that about right?
More in terms of GDP. So
I know it's about, but as I was converting from the percentage of GDP, I'm pretty sure last time I looked this up, and I meant to today, but these pesky students of mine got in the way and actually showed up at office hours. So anyway, but I believe it is on the order of $2.5 trillion. Okay? Total ODA, Official Development Assistance, foreign aid, is about $160 billion. Okay? And we all think about that and worry all about that and whether that's going to be cut by 10% or whatever it's going to be cut. And that's an important topic. But to keep that in perspective, revenues that low and middle income countries themselves are generating are by an order of magnitude the most important source of domestic finance. And that number is the one that's growing the fastest. I'm also pretty sure that if you look back 20 years to today, that amount of money that countries are collecting themselves has grown by more than $1 trillion. So the increment in just the last 20 years is more than $1 trillion. I don't know where you're from, but where I'm from, that's big money. That's a lot of money here. Now, in fragile states post-conflict, the numbers are obviously not as big, both in terms of the level but also the growth over the last 20 years. Because most of the growth in revenue from developing countries has actually come from growth in GDP. The share of revenue collections to GDP has increased a little bit. It's increased a couple percentage points, I think, if you go back a couple of decades, and that's important. But what's really driven it is GDP has been growing by 4, 5, 6% a year, and you do that for 20 years, and your tax base gets pretty big pretty fast. And I dwell on that because if you think about that for just a few seconds and think about that for the future, this is the future of development finance, right here. This set of issues that we're talking about here. And when we're talking about the specific issues of the difficulties of working in post-conflict and fragile states, this is where the action is. And I think we tend to forget that in Washington a little bit because we focus so much on foreign assistance, and I plead guilty. I've done that as much as anybody. But this is really where the action is. So this is a fundamentally important issue, and as we think about the SDGs and all of the related issues going ahead, it is domestic finance and the ability to increase domestic finance, which is going to be the major financial driver of success in those issues. So this is really important. There's a real puzzle, however, for fragile states and post-conflict countries in that how do you collect it? Where do you start? You don't have the capacity, you don't have the people, you don't have the skills, you don't have the institutions, you don't have the data, and it's a really complicated set of issues, which I've worked on in several places that had quite weak capacity, coupled with strong leadership in some of them. The quotes, all of the sources of Liberia doing really well, they keep popping up in this paper. It's because of her. But it's a real challenge to begin to think, where do you start? And the paper does a really nice job of laying out, look, don't get too complicated. Start with the low-hanging fruit. Start with the tax revenue systems that you've got and go after the revenues that are not being collected by anybody. They're not even being stolen, really. They're just not even being collected. And go out there and push on customs revenue, tighten up on natural resource rents and revenues, and on the expenditure side, do some basic control on monitoring expenditures, and your revenues can go up quite a lot, and that's precisely what Liberia did in other countries as well. So starting with the low-hanging fruit. But then if you're going to be successful, you have to have this long-term strategy, and Sarah pointed out, and the paper pointed out, the importance of time. Building capacity in anything, whether it's in delivering health services or education services or building and maintaining infrastructure or your judicial system or your fiscal space, takes a lot more time than we're used to thinking about it. This is decades, if not generations. So it takes a long time. So you've got to think, if you're the Minister of Finance, in those kinds of time frames of over multiple years. Where do we start? What can we achieve in the next few years, and where do we go from there? We start with the low-hanging fruit, and then we can move into building up, usually it's on customs collections, and then usually on revenues from natural resource base, and then perhaps get into your goods and service taxes and eventually move to a value-added tax over time when the capacity comes up. And you've got to think that through a little bit and what the timing might be. Then you can think about, how do you get there? There's my roadmap, and how do I get there? What's the combination of things that I need to get there? And there's usually 4 or 5 key components to that. One is the basic laws and rules. You got to work with Parliament here, the legislature, to get that to happen. A second, related to that, is you've got to set up the processes and build the institutions. And again, you've got to start with simple processes where you can make a lot of progress. And I've seen way too many places and the TA comes in and they want to build the best, and they make it far too complicated and focus too much attention on complicated things, so we don't even take the first easier steps on either collecting revenues or controlling expenditures. So you start with these processes of where you are. Then you build in the TA, and with it the training. There wasn't much said in the paper or in the presentation on training, a little bit, and you'll come back to that, I'm sure. And there is a debate that's going on, not just in this space, but in other spaces, about the relative merits of technical assistance versus training in terms of building capacity. But you do need, I think, people with training and with basic skills and that they build themselves that can partially come from TA, but in some sense comes from more formal courses. And then there's another component, which is public outreach, which is mentioned in the paper, not mentioned much here. But if you're going to do this over time, you need a very strong communications strategy where you're working with Parliament and the legislature, you're working with the legal, the Ministry of Justice, you're working with local NGOs, you're working with others. And I was struck on East Timor, where one of the most eloquent spokesmen saying nice things about the IMF was an NGO representative. And it's not every day of the week that you have the NGO saying nice things about how well the IMF is doing collecting taxes. Sorry to rib all of you IMF folks a little bit. But that speaks to the importance of outreach, of explaining what you're doing and why you're getting there. And that's really important because if you don't, especially with the legislature, you get creamed because all you're doing is raising taxes on poor people and you can't succeed. So you've got to have that public outreach as part of your capacity building. But I want to focus just a couple things on, and questions really, on this aspect of TA and about your experiences on this. Number one, you mentioned the importance of donor coordination, and that's true. There are several donors acting in this space. The U.S. Treasury has quite a robust program. The IMF does, the World Bank does, and several other donors do. So beyond, a question for you, beyond telling us that donor coordination is important, how is that best done from your experience? Where have you seen that done well and how? I suspect it has a lot to do with a Minister of Finance who can understand the different roles that the donors can play and that coordination comes from the government itself. But that's my answer. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You know, how does that donor coordination happen in a good way where, as the IMF, you have been coordinated in a way that makes sense? That's one question. Second, and Sarah touched on this as well, is how you are thinking about the day-to-day presence. There was, again, a mention in the film about resident advisors. And Antoinette has heard me talk about this before. I've long felt that the most important people with the IMF are the resident reps, but they are not always valued as high in the organization. But the people that are there day-to-day, building those relationships, fighting the fight day-to-day, are so critical. And the fund at its core doesn't work that way all the time, but I'm wondering what the discussion is internally about that balance between the people that are here and go on missions relative to the presence on the ground. So that's the second question. And then the third is, on this space, is if you can comment to the extent that you feel you are able, something that's not in the paper at all, about how many donor flows, and this is not the IMF, but donor funding actually undermines fiscal capacity by having parallel structures for how their money moves. And the IMF is absolutely, not doing this because they don't go through parallel structures. But almost all other donors do, especially in failed states. USAID does it, the World Bank does it, almost every bilateral donor does it, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, they all, in order to protect their money, they set up parallel systems so that the money does not go through the ministries of finance. The money is completely separate and usually funds TA or funds people coming in, or if the money does flow in at all, it's through a separate kind of funds, often managed by the donors. And not only does that not help build capacity, it weakens capacity because those organizations hire away some of the most capable people from the Ministry of Finance. They hire the best accountants and auditors and budget people and go home and tell their bosses back in Washington, we're very happy we hired the best accountant in the country. Where did you get him? He was the deputy minister at the Ministry of Finance and we just hired him, isn't that great? But we actively undermine capacity. And I do wonder if you see that changing, if you know of examples of how donors have been more creative in how they move their money to create incentives to actually use the systems, to build the systems, And there are some beginning elements here. And Jacob Hughes is sitting here. He's done a lot of work in this area with the Pool Fund in Liberia, and others have worked on this, of thinking about how we can move the money in ways that actually use the weak systems and therefore build them. I don't think you can strengthen systems unless you use the systems. You can have all the TA and training in the world, but if the systems are not used, they cannot be strengthened. And how in fragile states can donors both protect their funds but better use the systems in order to help build those systems over time. And I think it's a really complicated issue, but I think it's a really important issue that we too often, frankly, ignore in discussions on donor circles. So let me stop there.
Well, a huge number of questions, of course,
as always.
that time does not allow you to answer all of them. But clearly, to respond to some of the issues that Sarah raised around political economy. And I mean, Catherine, you talked a lot about how the specific strategies for individual countries are really mapped to the realities there on the ground. One of those realities, of course, is the political economy dimension of things that is not spoken about much in the paper. And maybe to speak to that a little bit, Sanjeev, and also to talk about this issue of focusing TA on solving practical problems. How do you deal with that? And another question about the relative importance and how do you deal with trade-offs between investing in conflict prevention when there may be tensions with the macro picture at that time. Why don't you start there and then come to some of the issues that Steve raised around donors, of course, around the importance of revenue mobilization more generally, and outreach.
Thank you very much for all these questions. And since I'm the first mover, I can leave the difficult questions for Catherine.
Good strategy.
Or we can share them.
And we'll still try to leave enough time to come back to the audience.
First of all, on how to solve practical problems. I think, in fact, more and more of a TA is geared towards that in the following sense. Once we give advice on the overall strategy, we typically organize 1 or 2 day event to explain how to implement it. Then for a specific issue, we send an expert, short-term expert, for 4 or 5 weeks to help implement that advice. The concept of the regional technical assistance centers that Antoinette, you oversaw in African department is designed to help countries on a day-to-day basis to deal with short-term problems. So a short-term advisor will go for a week to a particular country, and then let's say there is an issue with cash management or with areas, will then focus on that particular issue.
Right.
So more and more is being done in that direction. In fact, since I manage the budget, so I can give some numbers, there are about over 1,000 short-term expert visits that we manage purely from headquarters. These are on top of the short-term expert visits that are going from regional technical assistance centers. So there are a huge number of people trying to help deal with these practical issues that Sarah mentioned, and I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. Political economy, I think, is something that is relevant not only for fragile states, but it's also relevant for all other groups of countries. So we have started to focus more and more on these issues. Your question about preventing conflict is also a political economy issue in some sense. So if you look at the latest example of Ivory Coast, where there was a mutiny by soldiers,
Right.
And they were given wage increase, and that was accommodated in the, so that could be seen as part of the conflict prevention strategy. To the extent that you can see this helpful, you don't really have perfect foresight in these cases. You can say ex post that you could have done something about it. So I think the fact that, again, taking up something that Steve mentioned, we have resident representatives which are different from resident advisors.
Right.
So we have across the world at present 70 resident advisors covering different fiscal issues. Most of them are in Africa. More and more are being installed in Africa, and there is a strategy now to install resident advisors in fragile states because of the reasons that Steve was alluding to. So we are now putting in more and more advisors, and the donors recognize it. So they are giving us more resources, and we are. And this was one of your recommendations, if I remember.
Absolutely.
Of the WDR. We initially had some concerns about it, but in the end, we see that there is a merit in installing, especially in countries where institutions are weak. And
Right.
and I think Sarah raised another important issue. What are the innovations that we are doing in delivering advice? And some of the innovations we discussed in the paper, which came about in the context of the Ebola crisis, we started to do it via video conferencing on a daily discussion with the authorities. We organized things outside the country because we could not go there. So there were many innovations that came about. But in addition, we are now thinking more and more about using new technologies in helping these countries leapfrog. And this is the forthcoming volume that we have on digital revolutions in public finance. Afghanistan is using some of the new technologies because you can't go into the areas because of the security reasons.
Right.
So we have to now use more and more of them to help countries mobilize more revenues. And I agree with Steve that this is where the money is. In sub-Saharan Africa, the revenue to GDP ratio in the last 15 years has gone up by up to 4 percentage points of GDP on average. Now that's if you look at the in terms of, I haven't done the calculations as Steve has, but it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And we see a potential of anywhere between 3 to 4 percentage points going forward in these countries. Of course, this will happen with some effort and institutional development. And that is where the Addis agenda comes in. So I think I just want to make one comment on parallel systems. I totally agree with Steve that we have to dissuade to the extent possible donors. And this debate was quite prominent at the time of the debt relief. I remember because we were involved in that, the donors were saying that let's install special advisors in these countries because the money will be mismanaged. In the end, we persuaded the donors to channel through the existing systems. So that was a very big victory for both bank and the fund to be able to convince the key players that money should be channeled through the budget. And Catherine mentioned that more and more countries, or bilateral donors, I should say, who are giving budget support are then asking us and others to do a PIFA assessment because this is a requirement for going back to the parliament. So I think this will not change totally. USAID is not going to change. But there are some institutions that are moving in this direction. I think I'll stop and let Catherine pick up some of the other issues.
Just a couple of practical points on donor coordination, how do we make sure that's not just lip service? And there are two things that we've seen developing in fragile states and others. One is the establishment of donor coordination groups, more formal groups that meet occasionally and whenever one of the member organizations comes to the country to do technical work, but to sort of have a much more explicit donor coordination groups with email groups and sharing of reports, and also debriefing of the advice that's given in the country and after the country. So a lot more time and effort is going into establishing donor coordination groups and briefing and communication among donors. The other thing is that and this is I wouldn't want to say new, but a relatively new area of advice ourselves to the countries is how do you manage reforms, and focusing specifically on the importance of setting up modernization, program modernization offices, and staffing these with people whose only responsibility from the government side is going to be to be aware of the recommendations that are being provided, how they fit into the organization's day-to-day work, and to help coordinate on the government side. That part is often difficult because they're not people who are often skilled and available to do that kind of work, but that doesn't mean that it can't ever get done. And so both sides, on the donor coordination side, but also focusing that part of the TA is managing change and managing the receiving end of technical assistance, and that's part of your overall strategy. So I think that's something that we're focusing on more now compared to a decade ago.
I know we're going to lose Sarah in about 15 minutes, so I certainly want to see if there are some questions that the audience has, of course, for the panel before we start losing them. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about very much yet, and that the presentation doesn't talk about much, but the paper does a little, is this issue of the potency of revenue conditionality in fragile states, and the conclusion that revenue conditionality does not produce results, at least in the considerable results in the time frame of fund-supported programs. And one question, the only question I have, I think I had other questions, but we don't have time, is to ask you maybe to speak to whether that's because it's poorly designed conditionality, perhaps, or not owned enough by countries, or whether it's more the characteristics of lack of capacity that the paper thinks is at the source of it taking more time to produce results. And what lessons do you learn about revenue conditionality and how TA is actually feeding into that?
It's more of the latter that you described. That is, they don't have capacity to implement some of the conditions which are being included in the program. What we found is that a large chunk of the conditions are drawn from the technical advice we give. So, and we found that, a country says, look, we are going to implement this anyway, why don't you include this in the conditions? Right. And that is the reason why we found, in general, excluding the group of countries such as fragile states, that the conditions that were included on the revenue side led to some improvements in the revenue performance. And this result was quite significant across when you sort of look at the numbers. And this conditionality, interestingly, has grown in the last 7-8 years. Because when you look back, you see that in the 2000s, just at the debt relief, most of the conditions were on the expenditure side. Because donors were concerned about ensuring the money will be used effectively. Right. Only in the last 7-8 years, you start to witness that there is a lot more conditions on the revenue side. And so we tracked every condition, and we looked at whether the condition was specifically on the administrative side, on the policy side, and how effective it was. And after doing this very detailed exercise, we found that it is okay in general, but when it comes to countries with weak institutions, maybe the program period is too short of 3 years to have them deliver on the condition. But it is very hard for us to say from there that maybe the conditions have to be changed. You see, but we don't see any outcome, positive outcome, that we see in other countries in the fragile states.
But surely there are some conditions you could think about that they could actually implement quickly, and that could, for example, just not doing exemptions, doing away with exemptions. Sometimes those are complicated. Sometimes that requires legislation, but sometimes that only requires that you just close some loopholes around that. That is certainly under the control of the Minister of Finance, for example. So there are different types of conditionality, and maybe looking at how you...
But exemptions is one of the hardest things, I think. This political economy.
Yeah.
And I mean, even now, one of the things that we are being approached almost on a regular basis by the ministers is they want to first have us assess what the exemptions levels are. But when we ask people to do that, many of the ministries which are giving these exemptions don't provide the information. So you need, and so the level of exemptions is pretty large, I agree with you, but that is the hardest. It's easier to raise a tax rate so then to get the exemptions out of the system. And in some sense is linked with the governance in the country. So you know that more than any one of us.
No, and it goes to what Sarah, I think, is suggesting in terms of understanding the political economy a bit better in the design of conditionality also. I think that's part of it. Anyway, let's see, before going on too much longer, what the audience wants to raise. We start here with John.
John Hickling, thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on this political constraints issue, because obviously a lot of what's been written and talked about here is the set of technical obstacles and then an idealized or a framework for a medium-term technical set of solutions to build up capacity, and I understand that. On the political side, there are obstacles at all stages, which you don't deal directly within the paper, but they're implicit. I'd like to ask, from all the experience of you on the panel, are there cases where, in retrospect, you've come back and said, in this case, couldn't we have dealt with one of the political obstacles up front rather than later, in some way in the sequencing of doing reform? So we don't just focus on the best technical answer first, but get some law passed or on the books while there's a window of opportunity that will allow us to do things later which will otherwise be more difficult, or something like that, which goes to dealing with these political obstacles. Thank you.
Let's take a couple of other questions. I think you had a question first, no?
Thank you to the panelists and to CGD for convening us. This is really a rich discussion, and I'm Jacob Hughes. I'm the Senior Public Finance Advisor for USAID. I work in the Global Health Bureau, and we work to try and roll out some of these reforms that happen at the Central Ministry of Finance level across the line ministries. I really have two questions. The first is, one of the big challenges in rolling out reforms across the line ministries is how you encourage reform to civil servants who may be grossly underpaid. I haven't read your paper yet. I'm going to. I look forward to it. But do you have any experiences at the IMF on advising countries how to overcome that initial challenge of improving performance out of highly underpaid civil servants in the area of PFM? I suppose that's enough of a question for me.
Dan Honig, Johns Hopkins SICE. I had a couple questions that basically look inside the fund. So first, it strikes me that at least a few years ago, from my outside perspective, it seemed that the most talented people didn't see it in their career concerns to spend substantial time working on and being in fragile states. And I wonder in what ways, if any, things have changed inside the fund.
Some things don't change very quickly.
I think
to support that kind of
tell
work.
you that.
Yes, or what can be done to change it. Sort of building on Steve's ResRep point, the fact that ResReps are so often A14s who obviously have a career concern to look back to DC for promotion since they can't be promoted in place has always struck me as a little perverse on that front as well. The second question is, and it goes a little bit to your point, that the recommendations of your technical advisors often then become conditions. It strikes me that the IMF both is an expert on fiscal affairs and a kind of traffic cop who also has signaling value to the broader donor community. And it strikes me that it's sometimes hard to ask honest questions and get honest answers from someone whose honest answer will then bind what a whole set of additional external donors do. And I was wondering how you think about that dual-hatted role as you roll out a more serious sort of fiscal advisory effort in fragile states. Thank you.
Why don't we?
You want to take some or
yeah.
It's better if it's not, then I can take some.
I want to just comment on the political obstacles, and in fact, we were talking about that with my colleague, with my group before coming over here, and we all said, well, it's not so black and white, right? When you're designing a technically focused reform, you're also taking into account political considerations. Sort of, if you're designing a large taxpayer unit or medium-sized taxpayer office, sort of, where are the sectors of economic activity where the most powerful taxpayers are? What kinds of powers is the tax administration going to need to try and ensure compliance or promote compliance among those sectors? So sometimes I think that difference is not quite so black and white, in that the political considerations, political economy considerations are sometimes implicitly they're implicit in the technical advice. So that was one observation I wanted to make. So when we're talking about, have a broad-based taxpayer register, have a large taxpayer unit, have sufficient powers and rights and responsibilities on the taxpayer side, there are political economy aspects to that. So that's one observation I wanted to make. I think on just quickly, and I won't talk about the salaries on the PFM side. Sanjeev, you probably know a little bit more about that, but one thing I wanted to highlight is that there is a difference between the country teams and the technical teams at the IMF. We tend to not shift very much from our regions, and also not shift because we are technical experts in one area. And what I've found is that over the years, we have very small teams, but we have been able to build up teams that work over and over again on the different fragile states, but also they work on, our staff can work on countries at different levels of development. So you can work, over my career I've worked on the European countries, on the ex-Soviet Union countries, on emerging market countries, on low-income countries, on fragile states, and that's something that people don't often see from the outside, that we have a little bit more flexibility within the technical groups in terms of our assignments. And there are people who love to work on the fragile states and are specialized in the fragile states. They've learned how they work, they like the crisis environment, and they're sort of like, the Green Berets of the Fiscal Affairs Department. I mean, not to oversell it, but we do have those kinds of teams, and I just wanted to convey that people, they like they like working on the Central African Republic and saying, well, what can we do? Or on Equatorial Guinea, what can we do? So that was one of the comments I wanted to make.
We can come back to that in a minute, because I have some maybe different views on some of that. But Sarah,
it's really, I think, a two-finger question for Catherine and Sanjeev, also on the political issues. That I have no doubts that the way that fund staff think about the political economy includes considerations that are not in black and white in the paper here. But I wondered for you, thinking about how to move the culture to make that even stronger and even more nuanced in how the fund responds, would it be useful for people to have some sort of examples out there? What have we found in sequencing? And I can think of two that have come up in this conversation. One is Steve points about coalition building and outreach in order to get support for laws. Another would be where we see that a macro reform is dependent on a reform being carried out in the justice sector or the security sector, in fact. The economic reform is not going to work unless the reform in the other sector is carried out. I wonder if that would be useful just as examples to encourage that kind of thinking. And then I wonder whether there are process things within the fund. How satisfied are you by the regularity of the political economy analysis that you carry out? And how satisfied are you with the partnerships that generally, and here I perhaps don't mean just in FAD, also in the country and regional departments, are engaged that could give you those insights?
I think the issues you're raising are quite valid. I mean, we, as I said earlier, we would like to encourage people to look at the political economy issues more and more, not only in the fragile states, but all across membership. So that's why we produced a volume where we wanted to look at some aspects of political economy and how it impacts on
This
economic
is the
decisions.
book this year, Fiscal Politics, yes.
So we started to look at it, but you know, in many of these areas that you mentioned, we will have to rely on the advice of other institutions. Maybe it's a UN or somebody else, which is more going into political economy issues. And they would have to tell the teams, look, we see this as an issue. Please reflect that in your thinking or your design of policies. After all, our teams are pretty small. They are all macroeconomists, so I think some feedback from some other experts would be extremely helpful. So I would...
and some more focused, I mean, what we were trying to do in the African department, for example, was to try to make sure the res reps had an explicit assignment in their terms of reference to really watch political economy developments and report on that and give that context to the discussion of country programs being considered. And I think it's work in progress, but that's certainly something that has started and that the fund is thinking more about very early days, I think, in seeing the impact of that, but certainly a sense that much more work on political economy was needed and understanding that. Maybe relying on others, but certainly getting our own staff, your own staff on the ground to pay
to
more
be
attention
able to have that
and to gather
conversation.
more. Right.
May I just a corollary to that in our technical work is something also that is sort of under the radar. But these resident advisors that Sanjeev mentioned, we have the people who are in the country, but also the people in the regional technical assistance centers who oversee from anywhere from 5 to 10 countries. They're often quite keen.
Sorry, we're losing Sarah. To say thank you very much, Sarah. Sorry you have to run to catch a flight back to New York.
That in a way these advisors are also our eyes and ears on the ground. So just as you know, we rely on the res reps, but we have now a bit of a little broader network in the countries too, and they also participate in our technical assistance missions whenever we go to the countries that they're working on. So they have a little bit more of that on the ground feel. What's going on? What are the authorities' concerns? What are some of the initiatives? What are some of the worries? What can and cannot work. So that, as you say, just relying on our own teams internally, I think it's good, but we can do better.
Just very quickly, if I can, on response to John, and just 1 second on Jacob's question that we're all meticulously avoiding because there's no easy answer. On John, on some specific examples about the political, it's a good question. Let me give you one and then a little bit of the explanation and then a second quickly. In the early 90s, when I was working in Indonesia, oil prices had collapsed and the Indonesian government, the Berkeley Mafia boys, wanted to push Suharto to change really away from relying on oil and into manufacturing. But one of the biggest constraints to that was customs and corruption in customs. And the head of the customs authority was Suharto's brother-in-law, and he was making a lot of money on scamming, on collecting all kinds of stuff coming in. But if they didn't fix customs, there was no way they could be competitive in terms of moving into labor-intensive manufactured exports. So it was framed to him by the Berkeley guys that if you want to be a grown-up modern economy and you want to really be seen as transforming this place into a modern economy like Korea, he wanted to be like Korea, like Taiwan, like Thailand, then you've got to get manufactured exports going. And you can't do it unless you fix customs. So it was framed to the leader of the country as this political obstacle is in the way of what you want to achieve. It's not about IMF conditionality or donor conditionality or about efficiency and economic jargon. It was about your goal that you want to achieve is being impeded by this political constraint. Suharto fired his brother-in-law, cleaned out customs, brought in SGS, brought in an external group to essentially run customs for about 5 years, and then reintegrated an Indonesian system. But that was huge. The only way that he was convinced to take that big political step, and it wasn't just his brother-in-law, it was all the companies out there that were getting away without paying, was because he saw it in his best interest for what he wanted to achieve. And so I think if you're going to do what you suggest, you have to see it from the perspective of the president or the minister of finance, and what's their big objective, and see it as in their interest to achieve that long-term interest to move that political obstacle. If they don't see that, then it's not going to happen. And we saw that a little bit in Liberia in the early days, because President Sirleaf saw that increasing revenue collection was absolutely central to achieving any of her goals of getting kids in school and fixing the health system or anything else. And so she was willing to cut out some of those exemptions and move on the tax stuff. So that has to be the driver. And then just finally, because we can't answer Jacob's question about how do we create better incentives for civil service that are completely underpaid, I don't have an answer for it other than I just wanted to at least recognize the question. But I think this is a much deeper question, which we've all struggled with on civil service reform and somehow reducing the size of the civil service and therefore increasing the amount you can pay civil servants and completely changing the whole structure of the civil service reform. And that's a completely inadequate answer, but I did want to at least...
I think it's a hugely important question.
It's big.
And as good as IMF technical assistance is, its capacity to really build sustained institutions over time depends on how well it takes on board those issues. And that's been one of the areas I've thought that the fund needs, and the fund and others who provide TA need to do a lot better at really looking at civil service reform issues, administrative reform issues, that are the context in which you implement these great first best technical assistance ideas. And if you don't change some of that, it's very difficult to see that it has lasting impact.
I think you're right about civil service reform, but keep in mind, this is also very much linked to political economy.
Indeed.
In most of these countries, there are no other jobs. So government is the employer of last resort, and therefore they hire everybody, and you can't really raise the wages along the lines that Steve is talking about. So when you reform, if you look at the experiments that countries have carried out of reforming civil service, virtually everybody after some years have come back to the same level, because this is where the jobs are, and this is where you exercise patronage. So I think unless the private sector is growing so rapidly that government is not the main source of employment, you will continue to face this problem. And donors have tried to resolve it in different ways by topping up the salaries of some of the people, which again distorts the incentive structure in the civil service. So there are no solutions, easy solutions to this problem, and we've looked at it repeatedly. So I think then they set up independent revenue authorities, which are supposed to have separate civil service salaries, on the assumption that this will improve the incentives and therefore improve the revenue performance. I think the thing is mixed. So again, they are doing some work. You're going to present some work somewhere. But I think there is the evidence is not there.
It's a similar political economy issue, that if the government really wants to improve the salary levels and the employment conditions under a revenue authority, then the revenue authority model works. But you can have a revenue authority and have the same sort of not very effective HR rules. So at the end of the day, it really depends on the government's willingness to change the rules of the game. And And in some countries, it's sort of on the margin, there have been improvements. But in many, I mean, and the revenue authorities have been a big model adopted in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But in many, I think, as soon as the government loses interest or there's a big politicization, then that model itself suffers. So it can't be outside of the sphere of government.
We're over our time already, but we can take one or two more questions if they're really urgent ones. Yeah, please. And we'll go on for another 5 minutes or so.
I'm wondering if the early days of Hurricane Irma has pushed us a little bit to think about environmental fragility in a different way than we've looked at other kinds of fragility. And in the case that I know, unfortunately, all too well, that one house down, is that you're going to have economy situation. One economy, it's going to be out for 4 years. Your entire tax base has been destroyed. And so the whole timeline and the expectation about what happens is different. So I'm wondering whether the experience in perhaps some of the Pacific Island countries has given you the basis for, convening a Caribbean and territorial gathering with the lessons of what does a recovery from environmental fragility entail, and what are the fiscal lessons?
Okay, very good question. Aaron?
Hello, I'm Arend Kouwenaar. I'm currently working for the African Development Bank, trying to help out a little bit on Somalia.
Sorry, can you switch microphones? Because that one's not working.
Yeah, it's not on.
There we go, good.
My name is Arend Kouwenaar. I'm working for the African Development Bank, trying to help a little bit out the Finance Minister of Somalia. Fragile states in the African Development Bank, they call it in fact fragile situations, in order to not to step on African toes, but fragile states, they're often in arrears, right? They're cut off from financial support from the international community, including IMF and World Bank. Now, the question is for the fiscal experts of the IMF, my former colleagues, what do you see as the minimum fiscal reforms to be in place before a fragile state is ready to move to restoring the relation with the international community? That goes to start one of the programs. So what do you see the minimum, both expenditure and revenue, to be ready to go for a full program and have arrears cleared and epic relief and what have you? And if you agree that fiscal also is the most important, then is there anything else, or just get the fiscal in order? Certain amount of revenue, expenditure, okay, then you can receive money.
You want to take it, or do you want to?
I don't see any other questions, so why don't we?
Maybe since I spoke about the framework for immediate post-conflict reforms, I think on the tax policy and revenue administration side, some of those measures would be close to what you're saying, minimum thresholds. You have to have, a very simple tax system with, two or three major tax instruments that can be relied upon to collect revenue, including revenue at the border, and then focusing on specific excise taxes for sectors that are the most productive and profitable in the country.
Telecommunications.
And for telecommunications is one, and in some of the countries that you're mentioning, the hotel sector, the tourism sector is another. And then having a basic framework for revenue administration. So you need a basic organization, with the main functions, with the core functions, and then having a group focusing on monitoring, being able to monitor the filing and payment of those core taxes that you've defined. So, in your immediate post-conflict and, probably in your Somalia-like situation, you really just want to get that fundamental, those fundamental revenue sources defined and administered by a core group of people in the revenue department, and include customs in that. So you have to have a combined group of customs and domestic tax administration. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the kind of approach that my colleagues are taking who are working on Somalia out of the country. They're working next door in Kenya with Somalian tax officials. And from what I've heard, Somalia is not one of our countries. It's going quite well. I mean, there's good receptivity to this kind of a framework and to getting the basic processes, basic organizational structure and basic processes, administrative processes in place. You'd mentioned administrative focus so that those systems and processes can begin to work and revenue can begin to be generated.
Just to add to what she's, I'll take, just to add to, there's a paper which was done by our sister department of Monetary and Capital Markets Department in 2004, which also lays out a strategy that you may want to look at for establishing a central bank and other kind of things. So you may, you just don't want to have only fiscal, you also want to have central bank. So I think look at that paper as well. On the environmental thing, we just did a paper for the board where we agreed that there is an issue of environmental sustainability in these countries. And then as part of that exercise, we started to launch some pilots. We've done it in 2 countries where we are looking at both the kind of mitigation strategies you need to deal with environmental change and how much money you need to adapt the infrastructure to this environmental changes that are taking place. So both mitigation and adaptation are being taken care of in this. These are very small island countries. So there is a lot of receptivity in the countries. And of course, these are expensive things to do, and somebody will have to pay for them. So I think that.
Okay, I think we're out of time, and we really could go on and on with a very, very good discussion, I think, and a hugely important one. And let's thank our panelists for their excellent presentation. I want to invite all of you who can stay to join us at a small reception to continue our conversation. Thank you very much.